The day before the blizzard that would change everything, a sheriff stood at the mouth of a cave on the northern ridge, demanding that a woman and her child come out. He had a court order. He had concerned citizens behind him. He had the law on his side. But the woman refused. She looked at him from inside that cave, her daughter beside her and a wolf dog at her feet, and she said words that would haunt him when the storm came. "In 7 days, you'll understand why I built this. In 7 days, you'll be begging to get in." The sheriff laughed. Everyone laughed. A cabin inside a cave, built by a woman alone? It was the ravings of someone unstable, someone dangerous. But when the blizzard came with the fury of something ancient and unstoppable, when the town froze and modern life collapsed, that cave became the only warm place for 100 miles. And the woman they had tried to remove became the only person who could save them. Her name was Ruth, and she had arrived in the mountain town of Coldwater 6 months earlier, driving a truck with Montana plates and pulling a trailer loaded with tools, timber, and determination. Her daughter Leah was 10 years old, tall for her age, with her mother's ice blue eyes and a maturity that came from having lived through things children shouldn't have to face. The animal that traveled with them was called Storm, a hybrid of wolf and malamute, massive and intimidating to those who didn't know him, gentle and protective to the two people who were his entire world. Ruth had purchased land on the northern ridge, a steep forested slope that most people avoided because of its isolation, and the cave system that ran through it. The caves made the land unstable, they said, dangerous, worthless. But Ruth had walked every inch of that property before buying it, had explored the main cave with flashlights and measuring tape, had understood something about it that no one else saw. This wasn't just land. This was protection. This was survival. This was exactly what she had been searching for. If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The people of Coldwater noticed Ruth immediately, the way small mountain towns notice anyone new, especially someone who didn't fit the usual patterns. She didn't socialize. She didn't explain herself. She drove into town for supplies, paid cash, spoke only when necessary, and drove back up the ridge to her property. Leah attended school irregularly, and when teachers asked why, Ruth said simply that her daughter was learning more important things than what classrooms could teach. This did not go over well. Within the first month, Ruth began the project that would define her time in Coldwater and eventually save dozens of lives. She started building a cabin inside the main cave on her property, not near the cave, not using the cave as a foundation. Inside it, deep enough that the entrance was barely visible from outside, protected by the mountain itself. The concept was so unusual that when people first heard about it, they assumed it was a misunderstanding. But hunters who knew the ridge confirmed it. That crazy woman was actually building a structure inside the cave. She was hauling timber up the mountain, carrying it into the cave entrance, and constructing something in the darkness like some kind of modern-day cave dweller. The mockery began immediately and intensified quickly. At the diner, people joked that she was preparing for the apocalypse. At the gas station, men laughed that she was hiding from something, probably the law. At the school, teachers whispered concerns about Leah's welfare, living in a cave like a primitive, deprived of normal childhood experiences. The consensus formed rapidly. Ruth was unstable, possibly dangerous, and certainly not fit to raise a child in such conditions. But Ruth didn't stop. She worked every day from dawn until dark, hauling materials up the steep trail to the cave entrance. Leah helped, carrying what she could, never complaining about the hard work or the strange looks from other children. Storm accompanied them always, his presence keeping curious townspeople at a distance, his loyalty absolute. What Ruth was building was far more sophisticated than anyone realized. The cave she had chosen had specific characteristics that made it ideal for her purpose. It was large, nearly 40 feet deep and 20 feet wide at its widest point. It had a natural chimney formation that vented to the surface, perfect for smoke dispersal. The walls were solid granite, stable and insulating. The floor was relatively level, sloping slightly toward the entrance for drainage. And most importantly, it was positioned on the ridge in a way that protected it from the prevailing winds while capturing southern exposure at its mouth. Ruth built her cabin with the precision of someone who understood engineering and the desperation of someone who knew time was limited. She constructed a wooden structure inside the cave, essentially a house within a house. The outer walls of this cabin stood several feet from the cave walls, creating an insulating air gap. The roof was steeply pitched to follow the cave ceiling, with ventilation that connected to the natural chimney. She installed a wood stove with a flue that used the cave's natural venting. She built sleeping lofts, storage areas, and a system for collecting and filtering water from the cave's natural seepage. The entrance to her cabin was designed with multiple layers, an outer door that faced the cave mouth, then a small vestibule, then an inner door, creating airlocks that would trap heat and block wind. She sealed every gap with materials she mixed herself, testing and retesting until she achieved complete weatherproofing. She installed windows made from salvaged materials, small but positioned to capture what little light reached into the cave entrance. It took her 4 months of relentless work, 4 months of carrying materials up a mountain trail, 4 months of measuring, cutting, fitting, and building. 4 months of ignoring the mockery and the judgment and the growing concern from town authorities. The breaking point came in late October when a social worker named Ms. Crawford made an inspection visit to Ruth's property. What she found shocked her: a 10-year-old girl living in a cave, sleeping in a wooden structure that Ms. Crawford deemed unsafe and unsanitary, being homeschooled by a mother who clearly had mental health issues. The social worker's report was damning. She recommended immediate removal of the child and psychiatric evaluation of the mother. The town meeting that followed was heated. People who had never met Ruth spoke with confidence about her unfitness as a parent. Teachers testified that Leah was being deprived of proper education and socialization. The sheriff, a man named Tom Garrett, listened to it all with growing concern. He didn't like the idea of forcing a woman and child from their home, but the law was the law, and if a child was in danger, he had a duty to act. Ruth was given notice. She had 30 days to move into town, approved housing, or Leah would be removed from her custody. The court order was clear. The deadline was firm, and the entire town watched to see what the crazy cave woman would do. Ruth's response was to accelerate her preparations. She stockpiled firewood inside the cave, stacking it in areas she had designated for storage. She bought food in quantities that made store owners raise eyebrows: 50-pound bags of rice and beans, cases of canned goods, bulk flour and sugar and salt. She purchased propane tanks, batteries, medical supplies, and water filtration materials. Every dollar she had went into preparation, into building redundancy upon redundancy, into creating a space that could sustain life when everything else failed. Leah understood, in the way children understand when their parent is fighting for their survival, that something important was happening. She helped without being asked, learning to stack wood properly, to organize supplies, to understand the systems her mother was creating. Storm, sensing the tension, stayed closer than ever, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. The townspeople saw Ruth's increased activity as proof of her instability. She was hoarding. She was paranoid. She was exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be raising a child. The countdown to the court deadline became a topic of daily conversation. Would she comply? Would she fight? Would the sheriff have to forcibly remove her? But Ruth was paying attention to things the townspeople weren't. She watched the animals on her daily walks. She saw the squirrels gathering nuts with an urgency that went beyond normal preparation. She saw birds migrating earlier and in larger numbers than seasonal patterns suggested. She saw elk moving down from the high country weeks before they typically would. She felt changes in air pressure that her body registered even if she couldn't name them. And she remembered patterns from her childhood in Alaska, from winters that had killed people who weren't prepared. She tried to warn them. 3 weeks before the court deadline, she went into town and spoke to anyone who would listen. She told them a major winter storm was coming, bigger than anything Coldwater had seen in decades. She urged them to prepare, to stockpile supplies, to check their heating systems and backup power. She was met with patronizing smiles and thinly veiled contempt. This was the crazy cave woman trying to justify her paranoia. This was a desperate woman trying to avoid losing her child by creating a crisis that didn't exist. The sheriff listened politely, then reminded her that weather forecasters were predicting a normal winter. If she had concerns, she should follow official channels, not spread panic. Ruth looked at him with eyes that had seen hard winters before, and said quietly, "When it comes, Sheriff, remember I tried to warn you. And remember where my cave is, you might need it." He later told people she had threatened him. She corrected him. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The deadline arrived on November 15th. Sheriff Garrett drove up the mountain trail with Ms. Crawford and 2 deputies, carrying the court order that would force Ruth and Leah from the cave. They parked at the trailhead and walked the half-mile to the cave entrance, prepared for confrontation. What they found was Ruth standing at the mouth of the cave, Leah beside her, Storm in front of both of them. The sheriff approached carefully, very aware of the large animal watching his every movement. "Ruth, you know why we're here," he began. "I do," she replied calmly. "You need to come with us. We've arranged temporary housing in town. Once you're settled in appropriate accommodation, we can discuss custody arrangements." No. The simple refusal hung in the air. Ms. Crawford stepped forward. "Ma'am, this isn't optional. The court has determined that your current living situation is unsuitable for a child. You need to comply with the order." Ruth's voice remained calm but firm. "In 7 days, the worst blizzard this region has seen in 50 years will hit. Temperatures will drop to 40 below zero. The wind will reach speeds that will tear roofs off buildings. The snow will bury everything to the rooflines. And the power will fail, probably in the first 12 hours. When that happens, most of the buildings in Coldwater will become death traps, modern structures designed for convenience, not survival. This cave, and what I've built inside it, is the safest place for 100 miles. I'm not leaving, and I'm not letting you take my daughter into danger." Sheriff Garrett had heard enough. "Ruth, you're making this harder than it needs to be. If you resist, I'll have to arrest you. Leah will go into temporary foster care. Is that what you want?" "What I want," Ruth said with steel in her voice, "is for my daughter to survive what's coming. What I want is for you to listen to what I'm telling you and prepare your town. What I want is for you to use the next 7 days wisely, but you won't. You'll dismiss me, like you've dismissed me since I arrived. So I'll say it one more time. In 7 days, you'll understand why I built this. In 7 days, you'll be begging to get in." The sheriff moved forward, intending to take Ruth into custody. Storm's growl stopped him cold. It wasn't loud, but it carried a promise of violence that even armed men respected. The standoff lasted several long moments. Then Leah spoke, her young voice clear and strong. "My mom's not crazy. She's the only smart person in this whole town. You want to take me somewhere safe? I'm already in the safest place possible. You want to take me to town, to houses that'll freeze when the power goes out? That's not protection. That's murder." The adults stared at this 10-year-old who spoke with the conviction of someone much older. Ms. Crawford tried to approach, speaking in the soft tones people use with children they think need comforting. "Sweetie, your mother has you frightened. There's no storm coming. The weather forecasters would—" "The weather forecasters don't know anything," Leah interrupted. "They have computers and satellites, and they still can't read what the animals are saying, what the air is saying, what the earth is saying. My mom can. We're not leaving." The sheriff knew he could force the issue. He had the authority, the backup, the weapons. But something in Ruth's absolute certainty gave him pause. What if she was right? What if there was a storm coming? Arresting her and dragging a child down the mountain days before a major blizzard would look very bad if her predictions proved accurate. He made a decision that would later save his life and many others. "I'll give you 7 days," he said. 7 days. If your storm doesn't come, you're coming into town willingly, or I'm bringing you in by force. Understood?" Ruth nodded once. "Understood. 7 days." They left, hiking back down the trail while Ruth, Leah, and Storm watched from the cave entrance. Miss Crawford was furious, arguing that they should have enforced the order immediately. But the sheriff was already second-guessing himself, wondering if he'd just made a terrible mistake or possibly the best decision of his career. Back in town, the confrontation became the topic of every conversation. The crazy cave woman had defied a court order, had threatened law enforcement, had filled her daughter's head with apocalyptic fantasies. People were outraged, calls came in demanding immediate action, but Sheriff Garrett held firm to his 7-day deadline, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Ruth spent those 7 days in final preparations. She tested every system in her cave cabin. She verified that the wood stove drew properly, that the ventilation worked, that the water filtration was functioning. She organized supplies for easy access. She created emergency protocols and made sure Leah understood them. She prepared not just for herself and her daughter, but for the possibility that others might need shelter, though she doubted anyone would swallow their pride enough to ask. On the 5th day, the weather began to change. The air pressure dropped noticeably. The wind shifted direction, coming from the north with an edge that cut through clothing. The sky took on a peculiar color, a yellowish gray that old-timers recognized but younger people had never seen. On the 6th day, the National Weather Service issued a winter storm watch, then upgraded it to a warning. A major Arctic system was descending from Canada, bringing extreme cold and heavy snow. The forecast called for 2 to 3 feet of snow and temperatures dropping to 0. This got people's attention. They began normal winter storm preparations, buying bread and milk, checking their furnaces, making sure they had flashlights. But they weren't preparing for what was actually coming. Because the Weather Service, relying on models and data, didn't see what Ruth had seen, what the animals had known for weeks. This wasn't a normal winter storm. This was something rare and deadly, a convergence of Arctic air and moisture that would create conditions not seen in the region for half a century. On the 7th day, the first snowflakes began to fall. Gentle at first, almost pretty, the kind of snow that made children excited and adults slightly annoyed at the inconvenience. The town went about its business, confident in its modern infrastructure, certain that this would be just another winter storm to weather and complain about. Ruth stood at the cave entrance, watching the snow begin, feeling the temperature drop, reading the signs in the wind and the sky that told her what was coming. She turned to Leah, who was feeding Storm inside the cabin. "It's starting," she said quietly. "By tomorrow everything will be different. By tomorrow they'll know I was right, and some of them will come. We need to be ready to help them, even after everything they've said and done." "Why?" Leah asked. "Why help people who try to take me away from you?" Ruth knelt down to her daughter's level, taking her hands. "Because that's what good people do. We prepare not just for ourselves, but for when others need help. Your father taught me that, and I'm teaching you. Being right isn't enough, being prepared isn't enough. We have to be willing to help even when it's hard, even when people don't deserve it. That's what makes us better than our anger." Leah nodded, understanding even if she didn't like it. Storm pressed against both of them, a warm presence in the growing cold. The snow continued to fall as evening approached, still gentle, still manageable. The town went to sleep that night, believing the storm would pass like all storms before it. That morning would bring inconvenience but not danger, that their lives and their safety were as secure as they had always been. But Ruth didn't sleep. She watched the snow through the small window of her cave cabin, watched the flakes grow larger, watched the wind begin to rise, watched the temperature on her outdoor thermometer drop degree by degree. She had seen this before, in Alaska, the winter her father had died because he thought he knew better than the land. She had promised herself then that she would never make that mistake, that she would listen to what nature was saying, that she would prepare even when others mocked her. And now, as the snow fell harder, and the wind began to howl and the first real wave of Arctic cold descended on Coldwater, she knew that everything she had built, everything she had endured, every moment of mockery and judgment was about to be tested. The 7-day countdown was over. The blizzard was here. And by morning the entire town would know that the crazy woman who built a cabin in a cave had been the only sane person among them. The transformation from winter storm to apocalyptic blizzard happened faster than even Ruth had anticipated. By 3 in the morning, the gentle snowfall had become a white wall of fury. The wind, which had been merely cold, became a screaming beast that rattled windows and tore at anything not anchored to the earth. And the temperature, which had dropped gradually through the evening, plummeted like a stone thrown off a cliff, from 20 degrees at midnight to 0 by 2 a.m. Add a 20 below by 4 a.m., and it kept falling. In her cave cabin, Ruth listened to the storm's voice change from whisper to roar. She checked her thermometer. The interior of the cabin held steady at 65 degrees, the wood stove burning efficiently, the multiple layers of protection doing exactly what she had designed them to do. Outside the cave entrance, the thermometer showed 35 below zero, and dawn was still 2 hours away. Leah slept peacefully in her loft, wrapped in blankets. Storm curled at the foot of her bed like a massive, breathing furnace. The cabin was warm, secure, stocked with everything they needed. Ruth had succeeded in creating exactly what she had set out to build, a shelter that could sustain life when the modern world failed. And the modern world was failing catastrophically. In Coldwater, the power grid collapsed at 4:17 a.m. The transformer station, overwhelmed by the extreme cold and the ice accumulating on power lines, simply gave up. One moment the town had electricity, heat, and the illusion of safety. The next moment, everything went dark and silent. Furnaces stopped. Digital thermostats went blank. Electric heaters died. And the cold, which had been kept at bay by technology and infrastructure, began its invasion. Sheriff Garrett woke to darkness and a cold that was already seeping through his walls. He tried his phone, dead. His radio, no signal. He fumbled for a flashlight and checked the thermostat. The house was already dropping below 60 degrees. He had a fireplace, but it was decorative, never really used. He had a generator, but it was in his garage, and between his house and the garage was a yard already buried under 3 feet of snow with drifts twice that high. The wind was so strong he could hear it bending trees, and he knew with a sick feeling in his gut that Ruth had been right about everything. All across Coldwater, similar realizations were dawning. Families woke to find their homes transforming from shelters into elaborate coffins. Modern houses built for convenience and aesthetics proved woefully inadequate against cold this extreme. Insulation designed for normal winters couldn't handle 40 below temperatures. Windows leaked air like sieves. Heating systems that required electricity were useless. Gas furnaces needed electric igniters and blowers that wouldn't work without power. The Johnson family, parents and 3 children under 12, huddled in their living room, burning furniture in their fireplace because they had never bothered to stock firewood. But their chimney hadn't been cleaned in 5 years, and smoke backed up into the room, forcing them to choose between smoke and freezing. They chose smoke, covering their faces with wet towels, breathing air that burned their lungs, watching their children's lips turn blue despite being right next to the fire. Old Mrs. Chen, who lived alone in a small house on Main Street, tried to stay warm in her bed under every blanket she owned, but at 83 years old her body couldn't generate enough heat to fight the cold invading her home. She shivered violently, then stopped shivering, which was worse. Her neighbor found her the next day, still alive but barely, hypothermia having nearly claimed another victim. The Martinez family tried to drive to relatives in the next town, thinking their SUV could handle the snow. They made it 2 blocks before the vehicle died, killed by cold that turned oil to sludge, and batteries to useless weight. They abandoned the SUV and tried to walk back home, fighting through wind that knocked them down and snow that buried them to their waists. The father carried their youngest child, the mother carried the middle child, and their teenage son struggled behind them, all of them knowing they might die before reaching home. By noon on the first day, Coldwater was in crisis. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it intensified. The snow fell so thick that visibility was measured in feet, not yards. The wind sustained speeds of 50 miles per hour, with gusts reaching 70. The temperature held at 40 below zero, and with wind chill it felt like 60 below. Cold that could kill exposed skin in minutes, cold that found every gap and crack, cold that was patient and relentless, and absolutely indifferent to human suffering. Sheriff Garrett made a decision that would save his life and many others. He remembered Ruth's words. "Remember where my cave is. You might need it." He knew where it was. And he knew, with absolute certainty now, that she had been right about everything. He gathered what warm clothing he could find, stuffed a backpack with supplies, and told his wife they were leaving. She thought he was insane. Go out in that storm. But he explained what Ruth had built, what she had prepared for, and his wife, seeing the fear in his eyes, trusted his judgment. The hike to Ruth's cave, normally a 30-minute walk, took them 3 hours. They fought through drifts that came to their chests. They were knocked down by wind multiple times. They lost the trail completely and had to navigate by memory and luck. Sheriff Garrett's hands went numb despite his gloves. His wife fell twice, the second time so hard she thought she'd broken her ankle. But they pressed on, driven by the certain knowledge that stopping meant death. When they finally reached the cave entrance, buried in snow but still accessible, Sheriff Garrett pounded on the outer door with fists he could barely feel. The door opened, and Ruth stood there, backlit by warm lamplight, looking at the man who had tried to arrest her just days before. "Please," he managed through lips stiff with cold. "Please, you were right. You were right about everything. Can we—" Ruth pulled them inside without hesitation. "Get in, quickly. You're borderline hypothermic." She worked fast, stripping them of wet outer layers, wrapping them in blankets, positioning them near the wood stove. Leah brought hot tea. Storm, sensing no threat, simply watched as his territory filled with the very people who had threatened his family. As warmth slowly returned to their frozen bodies, as feeling came back to fingers and toes with painful intensity, Sheriff Garrett looked around the cave cabin with new eyes. What he had dismissed as the project of an unstable woman was actually a masterwork of survival engineering. The cabin was warm, genuinely warm, not the struggling, barely adequate warmth of a house fighting losing battle against extreme cold. The air was fresh despite being underground, the ventilation system working flawlessly. Supplies were organized with military precision. Everything had a purpose. Everything worked. "How many can this place hold?" he asked Ruth. "Depends on how long we need to sustain them," she replied. "Short term, maybe 30 people. Longer term, we'd need to ration more carefully." "There are people in town who won't survive this," Sheriff Garrett said bluntly. "Elderly, families with small children, people in houses that aren't equipped. They need to be here." Ruth nodded slowly. "I know. I've been expecting them, but we need to be smart about it. Bringing people here in these conditions is almost as dangerous as leaving them where they are. What do you suggest? We wait until there's a break in the wind, even a brief one. We send out teams with ropes and sleds. We bring people here in groups, prioritizing those in the most danger. But we do it systematically, not in panic." Over the next 6 days, that's exactly what they did. The storm raged with barely any let-up, but there were moments, sometimes only 20 or 30 minutes, when the wind dropped enough to see more than a few feet ahead. During those windows, rescue teams went out. Ruth led the first team herself, with Sheriff Garrett and his wife. They pulled a sled she had built specifically for this purpose, designed to transport people who couldn't walk. Storm went with them, his superior senses helping navigate in whiteout conditions. They went to the closest house first, where the Martinez family was discovered huddled together, the father's feet black with frostbite, the children barely conscious. They loaded the family onto the sled and hauled them back to the cave, fighting every foot of the way against wind and snow and cold that was actively trying to kill them. When they arrived back at the cave, Ruth immediately began treating the father's frostbite, knowing she couldn't save all his toes, but hoping to save his feet. The second rescue brought the Johnson family, suffering from smoke inhalation and hypothermia. The third brought Mrs. Chen, who was so cold she wasn't shivering anymore, which Ruth knew was the final stage before death. She saved the old woman with careful warming, patience, and knowledge earned from years of living in Alaska's harshest regions. Each rescue was a battle against nature. Each trip out was a risk that could end in death. But they kept going, because people were dying in their modern houses, and the primitive cave was the only place warm enough to keep them alive. By the third day, 31 people sheltered in Ruth's cave cabin. It was crowded, uncomfortable, and tense with the awareness that they all owed their lives to a woman they had mocked and tried to have arrested. But it was warm. It was safe. And it was, quite literally, the only reason they were still breathing. Mrs. Crawford, the social worker who had declared Ruth's cave unsuitable for a child, sat near the wood stove with tears streaming down her face. She tried to apologize, but the words stuck in her throat. Ruth didn't make her grovel. She simply said, "You did what you thought was right with the information you had. Now you have better information. That's how people learn." The storm raged on. Day 4 brought the coldest temperatures, 52 below zero without wind chill. Structures in cold water that had survived the first days began to fail. Roofs collapsed under snow weight. Pipes burst and flooded houses, the water immediately freezing. The old brick buildings downtown simply crumbled, their mortar unable to handle the extreme thermal stress. Leah moved among the refugees like a tiny angel of mercy, sharing her toys with younger children, helping distribute food, keeping Storm calm as he adjusted to a cave full of strangers. She never said "I told you so" to the children who had mocked her at school. She simply helped, because that's what her mother had taught her, and because she understood something that many adults hadn't learned: being right was less important than being kind. On day 5, a family tried to reach the cave on their own, without waiting for a rescue team. They didn't make it. Their bodies were found later, frozen together, less than 200 yards from their house. The tragedy sobered everyone, a reminder that the cold was an implacable enemy that gave no second chances. Ruth used the death as a teaching moment, gathering everyone in the cabin. "This is what I tried to warn you about," she said quietly, without accusation. "This isn't a normal storm. This isn't something you can handle with normal preparations. This is what extreme weather looks like, what climate instability can produce, and it's going to happen more often. You can dismiss people like me as crazy preppers, or you can learn that maybe we see things you don't." Sheriff Garrett stood up. "She tried to tell us," he said to the assembled people. "She warned us. We laughed at her. We tried to arrest her. And she's saving our lives anyway. When this is over, Coldwater needs to change. We need to listen to people like Ruth. We need to prepare better. We need to build better. We need to be better." There were murmurs of agreement, but Ruth could see in some faces that they would forget, that once the danger passed and comfort returned, the lessons would fade. Human nature was like that, but some would remember, some would change, and maybe that was enough. On day 6, the wind finally began to ease. The snow still fell, but the terrible, constant scream of the wind dropped to a howl, then to a steady blow, then to something almost normal. The temperature remained brutally cold, 30 below, but it felt almost warm compared to what they had endured. On day 7, the storm finally broke. The sun appeared, impossibly bright on the endless white landscape, and people emerged from the cave like creatures seeing daylight for the first time. What they saw broke some of them. Coldwater was devastated. Most houses were damaged beyond immediate repair. Some had collapsed entirely. The downtown was rubble. Trees were down everywhere. Massive trunks snapped like twigs. Power lines lay buried under snow. Roads had ceased to exist, replaced by a landscape of drifts that had turned the town into an alien world of white. But they were alive. 31 people who would certainly have died were alive because of Ruth's preparation, knowledge, and willingness to help even those who had wronged her. The rescue helicopters arrived on day 8, bringing supplies, evacuating the most seriously injured, establishing that Coldwater would need months to recover. National Guard troops brought generators, food, and the infrastructure of emergency response. But when they heard the story of the cave, of the woman who had built a cabin inside a mountain and saved 31 people, they came to see it for themselves. The National Guard captain, a man who had seen disasters across the country, walked through Ruth's cave cabin with something like awe. "Ma'am," he said finally, "I've been doing emergency management for 20 years. This is one of the most impressive survival structures I've ever seen. The engineering, the preparation, the forethought, it's exceptional." Ruth accepted the compliment quietly, more focused on making sure her guests were cared for than on recognition. Over the following weeks, as Coldwater began its slow recovery, Ruth's story spread. News crews came. Survival experts wanted to study her cave cabin. Engineers wanted to understand her design. And the court order requiring her to leave her home was quietly withdrawn, replaced with an official apology from the county. But more importantly, the people changed. Sheriff Garrett became an advocate for emergency preparedness, using Ruth's example to push for better planning, Ms. Crawford rewrote her standards for what constituted suitable housing, recognizing that suitable meant able to sustain life in crisis. The families who had sheltered in the cave became a tight-knit community, bonded by shared survival. And Leah, watching all of this unfold, learned lessons that would shape her entire life. She learned that being different wasn't wrong. She learned that preparation mattered more than popularity. She learned that true strength meant helping others, even when they didn't deserve it. She learned that her mother, dismissed as crazy by people who thought they knew better, was actually the wisest person in the entire town. Ruth herself remained who she had always been, quiet, competent, focused on the practical work of survival rather than the acclaim of recognition. She continued to live in her cave cabin, continued to prepare for whatever might come next, continued to teach anyone willing to learn. But she also began teaching classes in town once it was rebuilt. She taught people how to read weather signs, how to build for extreme conditions, how to prepare for the disasters that were becoming more common as the climate became more unstable. Some dismissed her still, unable to change their fundamental assumptions, but others learned. And those others began preparing, began building better, began listening to the land instead of just the weather forecasts. Years later, when Leah was grown and had children of her own, she would bring them to visit the cave where their grandmother lived. They would climb the mountain trail, enter the cave mouth and see the cabin that had saved 31 lives during a storm that had killed 17 others in the region. And Ruth would tell them the story, not as a tale of her own wisdom, but as a lesson about listening to what the world is trying to tell you, about trusting your knowledge even when others mock you, about the importance of preparation, not just for yourself, but for the moment when others need help. "They didn't believe me," she would say to her grandchildren, "when I built a cabin inside a cave. They thought I was crazy. They tried to take your mother away from me, but I knew what was coming. I read the signs, I prepared. And when the 7-day blizzard froze the entire town, this cave became the only warm place for 100 miles. She would pause, looking at the small faces watching her with rapt attention, and continue. "The lesson isn't that I was right and they were wrong. The lesson is that preparation saves lives. Knowledge saves lives. Being willing to do what seems strange or difficult or uncomfortable, that saves lives. And being willing to help others even when they've wronged you, that's what makes us human." Storm's descendant, another wolf-dog hybrid that looked remarkably like the original, would lie at her feet as she spoke, and the children would pet him, feeling safe in this cave that had once been called unsuitable, but had proved to be the most suitable place of all. The cave cabin still stands today, maintained now as an emergency shelter and a testament to one woman's foresight. It had saved 31 lives during the 7-day blizzard. It has sheltered others during storms since, and it continues to teach the same lesson it taught that terrible winter, that survival depends not on the systems we build in comfort, but on the preparations we make with wisdom. Ruth's story became legend in the region, told to children as a lesson, studied by emergency planners as a model, remembered by everyone who had lived through that week when the modern world failed, and only the ancient practice of preparing for winter's worst kept people alive. And every time snow falls heavy and the wind picks up and the temperature drops, people in Coldwater, rebuilt now, stronger now, better prepared now, remember the woman they called crazy, the cave they called unsuitable, and the 7 days that taught them to listen to those who prepare instead of mocking them. Because in the end, when nature shows its true power, when systems fail and comfort vanishes, it's not the cynics who survive, it's the prepared. It's the ones who listened when others laughed. It's the ones who built when others mocked. It's the ones like Ruth, who knew that a cabin inside a cave wasn't crazy. It was exactly what would save them all. The storm had proved her right. But more than that, it had proved that preparation, knowledge, and the courage to be different aren't signs of instability. They're signs of wisdom. And wisdom, in the end, is what keeps us alive when everything else fails. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. These stories of survival, resilience, and the courage to trust yourself matter now more than ever. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that could inspire you, or even save your life someday. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever prepared for something everyone said was unnecessary, only to be proven right? Or maybe you learned a hard lesson about the importance of preparation. We want to hear your story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear Ruth's message, that being different isn't crazy, that preparation isn't paranoia, and that sometimes the people everyone dismisses are actually the ones who see most clearly. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. And remember, when everyone says you're wrong, but you know in your heart you're right, trust yourself, prepare, survive, and when the storm comes, be ready to help others, even if they doubted you. Stay safe out there.